For this last section, we're going to be dealing with the question of when are people likely to add or drop a charitable gift in their estate plans. This is fundamentally a different question than we were looking at before. This is a question of timing. Before, all of these questions had to do with finding the right people, but now we're actually looking at when is the right time. That is, when is that critical time when people are making those decisions to add or those decisions to drop a charitable gift in their estate plan. So again, going back to the whole purpose of all of these lectures, the whole overall purpose is to answer the question of how do we reach the right people, okay, at the right time with the right message. So reaching the right people at the right time with the right message means that beyond knowing who makes these kinds of gifts, it also suggests that, okay, we want to know, who has these gifts during life in their estate plan, who would put those gifts in if we could get them planned, who is likely to actually transfer dollars at death, not just having it in their plan at life, but transferring dollars at death, and who transfers the big dollars at death, right? Those are all factors about the type of person, that is the person we want to be dealing with. We want to prioritize spending time with this target audience. But this is different. This is about when. When do these decisions take place? What is the right time? So when we talk about the right time, what we mean fundamentally is when do plans change? So if we want to know when do plans change, let's first look at what are the factors that predict when charitable plans are added. So the way this analysis is done is a longitudinal analysis that is called a fixed effects analysis. So let me give you an example. We're looking at the top 10 factors predicting when charitable plans are added. What does this mean? This means we're predicting when a person would first say, no, I do not have a charitable component in my estate plan. And then when the next survey comes along 2 years later, that same person says, yes, I do now have a charitable component in my estate plan. Okay, so we want to know what else changed during that period of time. And in particular, we then look statistically to say which of those factors, that is, which of those changes is most predictive of the change in going from having no estate planning component that has charity in it to having charity in the estate plan. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. If somebody comes into the survey and they say from the very first that they have a charitable component, then it doesn't help in this study. This study, we're only looking at those people who switch from not having a charitable component to those who have a charitable component. And here we're dealing with a little over 12,000 decedents in this particular study. So what are the top 10 factors? Using what's called a fixed effects longitudinal analysis. The number one factor was approaching death. This is the strongest predictor by statistical significance. If a person was actually approaching death, that is, it was the last survey they filled out before they died, that is the strongest predictor that they're actually going to add charity into a will or trust document when they did not have that in a will or trust document before. The second most powerful predictive factor is that they became a widow or a widower. So this actually deals with the two most powerful categories of changes that predict the addition of a charitable estate plan. One is what I call death becomes real, and the other is family structure changes. Okay, when either death becomes real, here, in fact, they were in their last few months of life. It was the last survey they filled out before they died. Or family structure changes. Here they were married before, now they're not. And also a strong reminder of death because the spouse passes away. Those are the two types of factors that we see a lot. The third, diagnosis with cancer. This fits into that same category of death becomes real. So if we think about which of these relate to the death becoming real, we've got they're actually approaching death, their spouse just died, they receive a diagnosis that they have cancer. Now, what this means is that in previous surveys, when answering the question, have you ever been diagnosed with cancer, other than sort of minor skin cancer, they had always said no. And now what happens is they change their answer to that question and they say, yes, now I have been diagnosed with cancer. So this is actually a first diagnosis with cancer. We're not able to capture multiple diagnoses in this study. Death becomes real could also relate to this one. This is decline in self-reported health. So this is not somebody who's always been grumpy about, overall how is your health these days, that they're always saying, oh, it's awful, it's awful, it's awful. These are people who had been saying, I'm doing great, doing excellent, very good, excellent, very good, and then, oh, no, fair or poor. Okay, this also relates to the death becomes real. Divorce, that's not death becomes real, but that is a family structure change. This one's both of those two factors, but this is a family structure change. Diagnosis with heart problems, that's a death becomes real. First time that they get that diagnosis. First time they get diagnosed with a stroke, death becomes real also. This first grandchild, this is change in family structure. Now, this seems odd because we're saying, wait a second, this is predicting adding a charity. Why would you add charity when you have your first grandchild? The reason is that when you have your first grandchild, what do? You engage in new estate planning. And if you didn't have a charity in your plan before and you engage in new estate planning, maybe it was the first time that you ever completed a will or trust document, even though the birth of the first grandchild was the motivation for completing that document, there's now a chance that you're going to have a charitable component to that. A few things, so again, change in family structure. So all of these factors, when we're looking at what predicts when people are going to add a charitable component who didn't have it in their plan before, all of these factors are either family structure changes, right? First grandchild, divorce, becoming a widow, widower, or they are what I call death becomes real. Now, the two that aren't in that category are the last two. And one is that you get more wealthy. As people become more wealthy, two things happen. They become more likely to plan and they become more charitable. And then just this saying, hey, as people get more charitable during life, that is, they're giving more, they also become more likely to add charity into their estate plan. So those are the top 10 factors that predict when people are going to add a charitable component to an estate plan that did not have a charitable component in it before. Either they had a will or trust and they said, no, I don't have charity in it, or they didn't have a will or trust. Either one of those represents an estate plan that does not have a charitable component. All right, now let's look at the flip side of that. These are the 10 factors that predict when charitable plans are dropped. Again, this is somebody who affirmatively says, yes, I do have a charitable component in my estate plan. And then in the next survey, they say, no, I no longer have a charitable component in my estate plan. And once again, we're using a fixed effects longitudinal analysis to see what else changed. What happened? What changed that predicted that change where they had some charitable component, and now they have no charitable component at all. So let's look at the top 10. So once again, as we look at the top 10, these things should actually begin to look eerily familiar. So for example, when we look at these first two factors, these seem to relate to this same idea of death becomes real. Their health gets worse, or they are actually approaching death. We know that retrospectively because this was the last survey they filled out before they died. What other health factors do we get here? Diagnosis with cancer, diagnosis with heart problems, diagnosis with stroke. And then we get what? We get the family structure changes. Becoming a widow or widower, both a death reminder and changes your family structure. Getting divorced, having a first grandchild, having a first child. So notice that first grandchild shows up on both sides, as do most of these factors. They're actually predicting increase in the likelihood that a person goes from having no charitable component to having a charitable component, and they predict that a person's going to go from having no charitable component to having a charitable component. This last factor, this is actually a death becomes real factor because this typically relates to entering into a nursing home. So exiting home ownership here may very well be a health-related issue. So when we look at these factors, what does this tell us? Well, what it tells us is this. Plans actually destabilize when either death feels near, or I say death becomes real, or family structure changes. Okay, so what happens is, let's say I've got an estate plan that has no charitable component in it. Maybe I've got a will or trust, doesn't have charity in it. Maybe I don't have a will or trust, in which case it's controlled by intestacy, no charitable component in that. When one of these two things happens, either death feels near or family structure changes, what am I going to do? I'm going to more likely engage in new estate planning. So before, I had no charitable component, and then I engage in new estate planning. Well, guess what? There's a chance I'm going to include charity in that new estate plan. Okay, so that's why these triggers are triggers for new planning, and new planning is a trigger for adding a charitable component if you didn't have one before. By the same token, if you had a charitable plan that did have, that is, you had an estate plan that did have a charitable component before, and one of these two things happened, what are you going to do? You're going to engage in new estate planning. So if you had an estate plan that had a charitable component in before, and you engage in new estate planning, there's a chance that your new plan is not going to have a charitable component in it. So that's why we get both of these factors are predicting both the addition of a charitable estate plan and the removal of a charitable estate plan, because both of these factors predict new planning. Now, I need to mention for a moment here that I think there's a misunderstanding about how planning takes place, because some people have the idea that a new estate planning process is going to automatically carry over the old plan, and that is simply not true. When I was in estate planning practice as a lawyer for a number of years, and as I've spoken at a number of different estate planning conferences, this is the majority practice that I've run into as I ask people, if you were to come in and say, I need a new estate plan, or I need an estate plan, if you were to bring with you a copy of your old will document, unless there is some question about your capacity to complete an estate planning document, that is your mental capacity to understand the things that you own and the natural objects of affection, your family members, all of that, unless there is some capacity issue, the old will doesn't matter. More to the point, I am not going to look at the old will. There is no reason for me to charge you the money it would take, the time it would take for me to read through that old will, because the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to write a new will or a new trust or new estate plan that's going to revoke that old will. So why would I charge you to go through and try to translate and understand what was happening in the old will when the first thing I'm going to do is essentially tear it up, right? It was something that I didn't draft, so obviously, since I didn't draft it, it was done wrong, right? It was done wrong because you weren't using my forms. It wasn't the most up-to-date sort of thing. I have no reason to go through that old will document. What I need to know is, what do you own and where do you want it to go? Maybe some more detailed things like, would you like to put any instructions with the money and all that sort of thing. But I don't need to know what was in your old will, and I don't need to charge you for that. So instead, what is much more efficient is for me to just directly get the information from you about what do you own and who do you want to leave it to. Okay, and I can do that much more directly without having to translate an old will because I'm going to have a standard intake process, maybe a standard asset disclosure and survey or questionnaire form where I can get that information. And then I've got that information. Not only have I got it, but I've got it into my automated system, essentially, that allows me to produce the highest quality documents that reflect the desires of the client. So the idea that you come in with an old will and that somehow what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at that old will and we're going to do, of all crazy things, we're going to add a codicil to that thing is just crazy talk. That's not what I'm going to do at all, especially if it's not my document. I am not going to, the last thing I want to do is to add a codicil onto your will, because I'm essentially now taking, as a lawyer, I'm taking that liability on for that other person's document, okay? Because I'm now adding a codicil. If there was something wrong with it, maybe there was something that wasn't wrong with it when it was written, but the statutes have changed since then, and now it's not written up to date. I have now made a codicil that does not take into account the changes that were made in the law that make the old document now inappropriate. And I'm exposing myself to the liability for something that I didn't write because I didn't fix it when I added a codicil to it. So do you see how the last thing I want to do as a lawyer is to add a codicil to another document, start making myself liable for somebody else's mistakes? I mean, I spend a lot of time as an estate planning lawyer making sure that all of my language, all of my forms, all of my phrases are up to date. And I know what the latest court decisions are, and I know what the latest statutory decisions are, whether it's tax implications or probate implications. I am on top of things. And to suggest that what I'm going to do is, instead of using my latest, best phrases and forms that produce the best results, I'm instead going to translate this old nasty thing that I didn't write and try to somehow hammer it into shape by adding or modifying, each of these paragraphs or phrases within that. Well, that's just crazy talk. I'm not going to do that. And furthermore, it makes absolutely no sense for me to charge a client all of the ridiculous amount of time it would take for me to upgrade all of the components of this old will document. The only exception, of course, being that, look, if we're going to have a fight over capacity because the person in front of me, maybe they have capacity, maybe they don't, that's the only time that old will could come into play, because maybe we 100% knew that they had capacity when they filled out this old will, and now capacity is a little bit iffy. Okay. Then I will, then I'll take the time to work through that old will. But that almost never happens, right? So I am not going to deal with the old will. It makes no sense at all by any sort of practice standards. What makes sense is to do a new will. And the first line of that new will is that I'm going to revoke all the old wills that have ever been done before, right? So this idea that in particular, fundraisers have this idea that, boy, once we're in the will, that just, boom, that just automatically carries over. Because every time you do a new will, you just start with the old will and you add to it. No, absolutely not. Not at all. So it's this idea that we have in mind, this concept of the estate planning process that's 100 years old, right? This concept that, you're going to come in and estate planning is controlled by a single document, and that document is the will document. And if you want to change it, you're going to go into that same lawyer and make a codicil that modifies the will document. And no, look, we're in a completely different world now. And this is all electronic. We keep the forms up to date as a matter of good practice, and we want to have the latest language that reflects the latest court cases, and there's no charge. We're not writing these things out by longhand, right? There's no charge extra to just give you the latest document that has all of the newest things in it, as opposed to trying to add a codicil onto something that's 10 or 15 years old. And of course, the other issue is that will document, in most cases, doesn't control anything now, because we've got TOD and POD and joint ownership with right of survivorship and all of these beneficiary designations that actually control the assets before the will gets to it, which is why having a living trust is so important. So that's important to keep in mind here. And it's one of the reasons why when people engage in new planning, and fundamentally these things, what do they mean? These things mean new planning, okay? You get new planning and you get no automatic carryover. No automatic carryover that we had charity in the old plan. No automatic carryover that we didn't have charity in the old plan. We just start with, what do you have and who do you want to leave it to? Okay? So that's why we're seeing both of these factors are showing up at predicting adding charitable estate plans and dropping charitable estate plans. It's because charity is the caboose on the estate planning train. It's not the engine. Charity doesn't drive the planning. What drives the planning is death feels near or family structure changes. That planning then takes place, and at the end of that planning process, there's the caboose, which is, do you have charity or not? Okay, so that's what's taking place here. The only other factor that has shown up in some other studies that I should mention, but these weren't studies that I conducted because we don't have it in this data set. But some other surveys have shown that another factor that can predict new estate planning is when people go on international trips, especially if it's the first time they've ever been out of the country. Travel will predict engaging in new estate planning. And of course, if plans destabilize, new estate planning means they're going to drop charitable component or they're going to add charitable component, or at least the probability for that goes up. So I would add to that, and in essence, I would just put that in this category. People freak out about travel. What if something happens to us in the plane or overseas? And it also gives them a deadline. It's not just death feels near generally, but we need to get it done before the trip. So travel would also fit into this category. Now, we've looked at what happens when death feels near for adding and dropping, right? And we've noticed that the factors are very much the same. There are a few differences. In particular, we notice that increasing charitable giving is a positive factor here. So what if we add them together? Okay, because a lot of these things predict both adding and dropping. What drives the net change? So this is a question of what is the net effect of these. And here's what happens when we put things together in terms of the net effect. Now, a lot of these, they're just going to balance out. A lot of these factors predict a dramatic increase in the likelihood of adding a charitable component to an estate plan that didn't have it before, and they predict a dramatic effect of dropping a charitable component to an estate plan that didn't have it before. But they might net out to on net mean nothing. So what are the things that do have a net effect? No surprise here, people's behavior during life has a net effect. If somebody moves from not being a donor of at least $500 a year to being a donor of at least $500 a year, the change in the conditional probability of adding a charitable component goes up by 8%. So this is the combined effect of the changes on the presence of a charitable plan. So the conditional probability that the change in conditional probability that they're going to have a charitable estate component goes up by 8 percentage points if that person moves from not being a donor to being a donor. Similarly, the change in the conditional probability that they're going to have a charitable component goes up by about 6 percentage points if they weren't volunteering before and they begin volunteering. Same is true vice versa. So if they were giving and they stop, this is negative. If they were giving, they stop, this becomes negative. The next factor is if they become wealthier. As you become wealthier, the net effect of becoming wealthier is an increase in the likelihood that you're going to have a charitable component in your estate plan. As people become wealthier, they become more charitable. As they feel wealthier, they become more charitable. It is also not just a matter here of whether you are volunteering or not, but it's also a matter of, so here's the effect of volunteering or not. Here's the effect of increasing your volunteering hours. So if you are not only begin volunteering, but you volunteer more and more hours, that also increases the likelihood on net that you're going to have a charitable component. It changes the conditional probability over time that the same person is going to add that charitable component. So some other factors, being diagnosed with cancer actually has a net positive effect. Now, we know it has both a positive and a negative effect. We saw that in the previous results, but when you add those two things together, it's actually a net positive effect. The same thing that we saw with volunteering, we also see here with giving, where again, if you weren't giving and you before and you start giving, that's positive. Also, if you start giving more, if your dollar giving goes up, that's a positive indicator that you're going to be on net adding a charitable component to your estate plan. And of course, these work the opposite way as well. If you were giving and then you stop, this becomes a negative number, or if your giving goes down, this becomes a negative number. The next factor is becoming a widow or widower. This actually increases the net probability that you're going to have a charitable component. Now, for some people, becoming a widower means you drop the charitable component. Let's say the wife was not charitably inclined. The husband was. They had a compromise will. They were mirror image wills, which is very common within married couples. But he dies. He was the charitable one. So she does a new will, and there's no charity in it. So there is, in fact, an increased probability that you're going to drop a charitable component. But there's also an increased probability that if you didn't have a charitable component, you're going to add it. Well, on net, the additions are more than the deletions. So becoming a widow or a widower on net increases the charitable planning. And this actually makes sense because if you think about it, most married couples have estate plans that are what's been called the I love you will, which is basically everything goes to the surviving spouse. So it may be that once that isn't the first stage plan, because it can't be, the surviving spouse has already died, now you start thinking more seriously about who's going to get some of these funds in the end. And then finally, the last factor that was significant at predicting a net increase is that this was the last survey prior to death. So what that means is that as people actually approach death, and we'll see this in some other statistics here in a moment, as people actually approach death, there's actually a lot of dropping of the charitable component, but there's also a lot of adding of a charitable component to plans that didn't have it before. But on net, there's more adding than there is dropping. So as that person is actually approaching death, we know that retrospectively because this was the last survey they completed before they died. On net, people become more charitable when it is the last survey they complete before death. They become more likely to say, I've got a charitable component in my estate plan. So those are the net effect from those different factors. Now, we've been looking at when are people likely to add or drop a charitable gift in their estate plan. And that is simply dealing with this question of what do the plans look like during life? Okay. So what I mean by that is, so for example, the last survey before death, this is predicting, and again, we saw it in here as well. And so we see it here. We also see it in the factors for adding, approaching death. This is predicting when somebody during life is saying, yes, I now have a charitable component. They're still alive here, even though they're getting ready to die. Okay, but they're still alive here. Now, we can change the question a little bit. So now, instead of asking when are people likely to add or drop a charitable gift in their estate plans during life, we now get more precise. And by more precise, I mean we just look at when are we seeing changes to the final estate plan. Why do we care about this? Because it's the only one that actually controls anything, right? I mean, it's great. All those other documents you fill out when you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, all of that. But the only estate plan that controls anything is the last one. So if we actually care about dollars getting to charity, we actually only care about the last estate plan because that's the only plan that controls any dollars. So let's dive into this. And again, we're now looking at some additional academic research. This is the article that many of these results are being pulled from. This includes data from the U.S. And from Australia. I will say a side note that there was a error in this, which I asked them to correct and they couldn't, which is, believe it or not, I am not associated with the Asia Pacific Center for Social Investment and Philanthropy in Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. That is my friend and co-author and colleague, Christopher Baker. And I told them to switch that, but they said, too late, we can't switch it now. So I am still from Texas Tech University. Christopher Baker is still from Swinburne, despite what is indicated on that article. Okay, so let's dive into some research on this. And this, I think, is perhaps the most important thing of any of the statistics if you're actually interested in transferring dollars to charity through estate gifts. So what we're looking at here, this may take a little bit of time to work through what's taking place here. This is only looking at people who are decedents who actually transferred dollars to charity at death. This is U.S. data from the Health and Retirement Study, where we had about 12,000 decedents. It is only looking at people at decedents who have actually transferred dollars to charity at death. Okay, so these are real estate donors, not just people who had it in their plan during life. They've actually are decedents, they've died, and they actually transferred dollars to charity at death. So what we wanted to see was, when did that plan get added? Okay, so how do you see when did that plan get added? Well, we know that they died with a charitable plan because we know where the money went, right? So you go back to their lifetime surveys and you find out when was the most recent point at which they affirmatively indicated, I do not have a charitable component in my estate plan. Okay, now we don't count it if they didn't take the survey that year, or if they said, no, I don't want to answer that question, which, they can do that. These aren't people who are hiding anything or saying, no, I prefer not to answer. These are people who are affirmatively saying, I, at this point, do not have any charitable component in my will or trust document. Okay, and so we're going back and we're seeing, when did they most recently say, I don't have a charitable component? Because when we find that point, we know that the final charitable component had to have been added after that point, when they indicated they did not have a charitable component. Okay, just some side notes in here. These are sort of technical side notes. We do not count if the person themselves did not answer the question, but somebody close to them answered the question. Now, here's the technical issue here. When people become in ill health, the way the survey works is, if the person is not able to answer the question themselves, then they will ask a spouse or caretaker, somebody close to the person, to answer as many of the questions as they can about the person. Okay, so in this case, if it was this spouse or person close to the respondent, technically it's called a proxy respondent, we didn't count that. So it doesn't count if it was the caretaker who said, no, they don't have a charitable component, right? It actually had to be the person themselves saying, no, I do not have a charitable component. So we want to be really confident that they did not have a charitable component at that point, so that we know when that charitable component was added. Okay, so let's look at this. This is the total number of estates, total number of charitable estates. The total number of estates, these are all charitable estates, based upon when the charitable plan, the final charitable plan, was added. Everything in either shade of red indicates a charitable plan that was added within the last 5 years of death. Okay? Within the last 5 years of death. If they were in this category, the charitable plan was added more than 5 years prior to death. And if they're in this category, they have always had a charitable plan for as long as they've been in the survey. Okay, so this is always, this is more than 5 years, and this is, either shade of red is within 5 years. Okay, the two shades of red are, this was in the last 2 years prior to death, and this was in the last 2 to 5 years prior to death. Now, this may be surprising to you, to say, are you kidding me? There's all of this end-of-life dramatic additions to the charitable component. People didn't have charity before, and now they do have charity. This is really surprising, right? That this is happening. Except if we take a very different approach. Now, again, this is just looking at decedents, people who have died, right? If we take a very different approach, we actually already knew that, because let's go back to top 10 factors predicting when charitable plans are added during life. Now, again, this is people who are alive when they're saying I have a charitable component, not what we're seeing in these new results are people who are dead, and where did their money actually go? What are these factors? Is this more likely to occur, in the last 2 years of death? Well, absolutely. This means they are in the last 2 years of death, right? Prior to death. They're between, 1 day and 2 years before death. They're in their last 2 years prior to death. That's the number one indicator, if they're in that last survey, that they're saying, yeah, I added that, right? And, which of these things, look at number 4, decline in self-reported health, right? And then, of course, other sort of negative diagnosis. This is not a surprise because we see it even when what we're looking at is what people are reporting during life. So it actually shouldn't be that much of a shock that when we now switch our methodology and we're now looking at what actually happened after death, that we see all of these end-of-life additions to the charitable plan. Because this is when people's self-reported health goes down. This is when they're actually in their last 2 years, they're prior to death. This is when they start getting all these negative diagnoses, right? So these things fit. Different methodology. This is not predicting when people say, I have a charitable component. This is predicting, this is looking at people, at decedents, at estates that actually transfer dollars to charity at death. And we get this, by far the majority of charitable estates became charitable in their plan within the last 5 years prior to death. Now, over here, we're not looking at the number of charitable estates. We are instead looking at the share of total dollars transferred to charity. When we start looking at actual dollars transferred to charity, you notice that about half of the dollars were transferred by plans that were added within the last 5 years prior to death. So we've got a larger share of estates than we have share of dollars. So that gives us a little bit of a hint that the last-minute gifts, although that's the typical gift, and by last minute I mean the last 2 to 5, the last 2 to 5, the last 0 to 2, so the last 5 years prior to death. Although they are the majority of the gifts, they're actually smaller gifts. That's especially contrasted here, where if we look at those gifts that people always said they had a charitable component, they're only 20% of the estates, but they're about 40% of the dollars gifted. So let's actually dive down into that a little bit more. So that we can get some more details here. Let me go to the next section here, so we can look at some of these different. So now what I'm doing here is we're actually dividing these up, at least these within the last 2 years of death. We're dividing these up into whether this was truly a new plan, meaning that every previous time they were asked, they said, no, I don't have a charitable component in my estate plan, or if this was actually a gift that existed at one point, then it went away, and then it was resurrected. Okay, so this is, they had a charitable plan in earlier, then they no longer had it, and then it came back within the last 2 years prior to death. So the reason that this is interesting is where we look at how big are these last minute gifts. So I would suggest that these are truly last minute gifts. These are people that always said, I don't have a charitable component in my estate plan, and then in the last 2 years prior to death, 0 to 2 years prior to death, they added in for the first time. These aren't really last-minute gifts because they were in there a few years ago, and then they dropped them out, and then they came back at the end. Okay, so this is the differentiation that I'm making here that I wasn't making in the previous slide. So let's look at the difference here again. Notice if we have one of these truly last-minute gifts, That is, a little over a third of all charitable estates were truly last-minute gifts that, as far as we can tell, had never been charitable before. They only represent about half that much in terms of the dollars transferred. Now let's compare that to a gift that was last minute, but it was a resurrected gift. Those gifts actually are much larger. In the same way that if we look at gifts that had always been in this is always reported charity in the plan, they represent a larger share of the actual dollars transferred. The last slide showed 39%. This showed 40%. The rounding slightly different on these two, but it's the same basic numbers that we're dealing with here. So what that means is that a long-term gift, this ones where people say I've always reported having charity in the plan, is worth about is worth about 4 times, right? So 20% of the estates, but it's 40% of the dollars, as compared to the truly last-minute gifts, 34% of estates, but only 17% of the dollars. So this is half of its actual share of estates is the share of dollars. This is double the share of estates. It's double the share of dollars that are represented. And so if we put all that together, what it means is that although most charitable plans were added within 5 years of death, one longer-term plan was worth 4 first made in the last 2 years. And that longer-term plan could be either a plan that they always reported, or in fact a plan that was resurrected. So this is important because sometimes people will see these results and they'll say, oh, well, everything in red are charitable plans that were added within the last 5 years prior to death. Okay? And so we don't really need to worry about planning until the very end of life, because all of this red stuff here, is so dominant. But it doesn't mean it's not a good idea to get in the plan early if you represent a charitable cause. Even though there is a massive amount of end-of-life instability in these plans, it's still a good idea to get in the plan early if you stay in the plan, because you get bigger gifts, right? If you stay in the plan, then you're talking bigger gifts. Or what we saw from the other is not only if you stay in the plan, but if you this one here, if you come back into the plan. You were in the plan before, and then you come back into the plan at the end. So bottom line, what that means is even though we've got a massive amount of end-of-life instability of plans being added at the end of life, it's still good to get into the plan early, because those early plans, the ones that were longer term, either stayed in all the way through or were resurrected, came back, they're worth more than one that was made for the first time in the last 2 years, and we saw no evidence of that plan prior to those 2 years. So do not take this to mean it is not a good idea to get in the plan early, but do take this to mean that you've got to stay with it all the way to the end, because things get super unstable at the end of life. So here's another source of data that tells us the same thing. So this comes from a study by Christopher Baker out of Swinburne University. And what he did was he took a study of a 5% national sample of probate records in Australia, 2012 probate records. I think one of the provinces was 2010, but around that same time. 5% national sample of probate records. Now, this is really cool because we can't do this in the U.S. Or technically, let me just say, we don't have a funder that will pay to do this in the U.S. And the difference is, in Australia, they keep their probate records at the province level. And I forgot, there's 5 or 6 provinces, something like that. But in the U.S., these are kept at the county level. So like more than 3,000 counties that we've got, or parishes in Louisiana. And because of that, these records are kept in so many different places. Doing a national sample is just cost prohibitive. It would be a massive undertaking. There have been probate record studies done before, but they're always just done on a single county, usually a large metropolitan area that will do these. So this is very cool that we actually have probate records, national sample from the country as a whole in Australia. Now, one of the interesting things about this study is that, working together, Christopher Baker and I were able to look at what's going on, in particular, with the wills that are charitable. And so what we saw here is that 31% of charitable wills were signed within 2 years of death, 60% were signed within 5 years of death. Another side note is those wills that were not charitable, they were actually much older. They were signed a longer time before the end of death. That actually fits with what we've seen in the U.S. data, which is this idea that, at the end of life, the plans become really unstable. But remember what we saw here. If this was the last survey before they died, the net effect, combining both adding and dropping, was a positive effect. And so that fits with what we see in the Australian data, which is wills with the charitable component were signed more recently prior to death than wills without a charitable component. Now, this tells us we've got, this tells us that we've got 60% of charitable wills were signed within 5 years of death. Now, let's match that with the U.S. results. This was the charitable wills that added a charitable component within 5 years of death. So what we're seeing here is this is showing us 65% of charitable wills added that charitable component within 5 years of death. So in order to add the charitable component within 5 years of death, you had to have signed a new document. Or a document. You had to have signed a document within 5 years of death. So 65% of the charitable estates in the U.S. results are from the charitable component was added within 5 years of death, and in the Australian results, 60% of the charitable wills were signed within 5 years of death. So we get a little bit of correspondence here in what we were seeing before, but the difference is that with a probate study, you only get to see the final will. Okay, so if, for example, if this was a probate study, we could tell that this final will was signed within 5 years. Assuming this, of course, could be a will or a trust, but assuming this is a will, we could see that the date of signing was within 5 years because the plan was changed, and so we've got this charitable plan changed. But what we can't see in a probate study, we can't see what the prior will was. In other words, in this study, we can't tell if, in fact, there was a change. Maybe, even though we know 60% of the charitable wills were signed within 5 years of death, maybe there was no change in the charitable component, even though they were signed more recently. But maybe the charitable component didn't change within 5 years of death. So we can't tell that in a probate study. We have to have that national longitudinal study, which is what the health and retirement study is, to know that, yes, in fact, not only were these wills being signed within 5 years of death, they were actually adding that charitable component within 5 years of death. And so these results are essentially what we're seeing here is all of these sources of results are telling us the same thing. So what I mean by that is, look, we've got different methodologies. We can see what are people telling us is in their plan when they're alive. Okay? When they're alive, as they approach death, they tell us that they are much more likely to add a charitable component and to drop a charitable component. On net, we know that, of course, when we net all those things out, it causes both sorts of changes. But on net, if it's the last survey before death, they're doing more adding than they are dropping. But having said that, we know that it leads to both adding and dropping. Okay, so if that's the methodology, and what we are looking at is what people say when they're alive, it tells us that as death approaches, which we know retrospectively because it's the last survey they filled out before they died, or we know because their self-reported health is falling, or they're getting all these negative diagnoses, all this sort of thing, that causes additions and deletions, right? Big changes in the charitable component. We also know, not from lifetime reports, but from actually post-mortem transfers. And we can see of those decedents who actually transferred dollars to charity at death, what were their lifetime reports of having a charitable component. That also tells us that, in fact, that charitable component was highly unstable at the end of life. That the majority of these charitable estates actually added in that charitable plan within the last 5 years of death. And then from the probate records, the only thing we get in the probate record is the final will, okay, the final will document. We go to the National Sample of Probate Records from Australia and tells us the same thing. Charitable wills, majority of those signed within the last 5 years of death, okay? This fits with this, fits with this. These all fit together. These all tell us the same thing. Plans, in particular, charitable component of plans, destabilize as death approaches. Okay, so as this is sort of the idea of what you might think of as triangulation, right? As you get more sources of information that are pointing to the same answer, you start getting more and more confident of that answer. And that's what we've got going on here. Sources of data from probate records, sources of data from lifetime reports, sources of data from post-mortem reports. All of those are pointing towards the same answer, which in this case is that plans destabilize as death approaches. So this increases our confidence as a research matter. This increases our confidence in the validity of this statement, that plans, in particular the charitable component of plans, becomes highly, highly unstable, in particular as death approaches. All right, so let's look at some other data that is going to confirm this instability of the charitable component of estate plans. So we know that it is unstable as death approaches. Let's look at its stability during life, at least in certain age ranges in general. So because this is a longitudinal study, we are able to see what happened to the charitable estate component during life over time. So this allows us to look at, for example, the 10-year retention. The 10-year retention rate is, the way you look at it is this. You take everybody who said, yes, I have a charitable component in my estate plan, and then 10 years later, you look at those people who are still answering the question, and of those, you say, how many of them still say, I've got a charitable component in my estate plan? Okay? So again, this is everybody who says, yes, I have a charitable component in my estate plan. And then 10 years later, of those who are still answering the question, what's the percentage who still say, yes, I've got a charitable component in my estate plan. Now, it's important to understand that we're doing it this way because this is a true retention rate. This is not saying, for example, that, yes, we've got some people that dropped out of the survey. We've got some people that aren't answering the question 10 years later. Maybe we've got some people who died. That doesn't affect our results directly here because for retention rate, we're only looking at those people who are still answering the question. Okay. So again, these are all people who said yes, if I can use my mouse to write here, who said yes 10 years before, in year 0. And now in year 10, we're looking only at the people that are still answering the question 10 years later. And among those who, I can't write letters. This is awful. Among those who are still answering the question, what percentage still say yes? Okay. So this is not being influenced by, a bunch of people died or quit taking the survey. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the percentage that still say yes versus compared to who is still answering the question. All right, that's the percentage we're looking at. So this is a true number. We're looking at the right number here. All right. So what do we see? Well, this is where we have to actually go back to some of the weird circumstances of the beginning of the HRS, the Health and Retirement Study. Now, again, from 1998 forward, the Health and Retirement Study has been representative of the 50-plus population. Okay. Before that, there was a predecessor study in 1992 called the Early HRS, but it didn't ask this charitable estate component question. But the predecessor study that was first done in 93 and 94, which was called the AHEAD study, it did ask this question, but it started with only people who are age 70 and above. Okay, so it's starting only with people who are age 70 and above, and because of that, our earliest data is only for that older age group. So what we did is take this earliest data, which was collected in 93 and 94, take it forward 10 years, which we're picking 2004 because there is no 2003 survey. By that point, everything's done in even years. Take it forward 10 years, maybe 10 years and a few months. And we say, what percentage among those still answering the question, what percentage still say, yes, I have got a charitable component in my estate plan? And the answer is we get a little over 50%. Okay. So within this range here. We do the same thing looking at those who in the 95-96 survey said, yes, I have a charitable component. And then they're asked 10 years later, among those who answer that question, we get about a 55% retention rate. Now in 98, this question, this survey expands to include everybody in the over 50 population, but I'm going to go ahead and keep them split out because we had the 70 plus population here split out. So I'll just keep them split out so it's easier to compare. And then we look at the 10-year retention rate 10 years later among those who had said, yes, I have a charitable component in 1998 who are still answering that question in 2008. What percentage of those who are still answering that question in 2008 still say, yes, I've got a charitable component in my estate plan? And for this younger group, it was about 55%. For the older group, just at about 60%. Okay, so the cool thing is, because this study's been going on for a while, we can keep doing this. So what happens when we keep doing this? So we move forward. Again, those who answered in 2000, yes, I have a charitable component. And then 10 years later, among those still answering the question who said they had a charitable component in 2000, what percentage still say they have a charitable component in 2010? And we get about 55%, a little less than 55%, maybe slightly more than 55%. We can do this again, 2002 to 2012, about 55%, about 55%. We can do this again, 2004, 2014. just under 55%, and now for that particular year, this one gets just over 60%. And then our latest results here, the 2006 people looking to 2016, what do we get? About 55%, a little more than 55% here. What is this saying? Folks, this is a really remarkably consistent result, right? So different groups, different 10-year periods. We tested again, different age groups as well. We tested again and again and again and again and again. And what do we keep getting? We keep getting 55%, 55%, 55%, 55%. If we got the result once, we'd have a certain level of confidence. If we get it twice, have a higher level of confidence. If we keep getting it again and again and again and again, and it doesn't vary that much, we get pretty super confident that the 10-year retention of a charitable estate component is about 55%. All right? Now, for those who work for nonprofit organizations, got some good news and bad news. Okay, what's the good news here? Well, I guess you could characterize this and say, well, most people still have a charitable component 10 years later, right? So it is most, but it's just barely most. It's 55%. However, if you have a legacy society, that is, you've got people who have actually taken the time to come forward and say, I want you to know, I have named you in my estate planning document. You might expect that the retention rate for those people is going to be higher than this. These are not people necessarily in legacy societies. This is just showing the what happens in general with charitable estate components that get added, get dropped. Okay, people that say they've got one, and then 10 years later, what's the percentage chance if they're still answering the question that they're still saying that they've got one? Okay, so for those people in your legacy society, you might expect a higher retention rate because those are people that have gone the extra step, right? However, there's also some bad news. This shows the 10-year retention rate of having any charitable component, okay? We cannot see specifically what charities they put in their estate plan. So if, for example, a person, let's say in the year 2000, let's say that they said, oh, I have your particular charity that you're working for in my charitable estate plan. And then in 2010, they've dropped your charity, but they've added in somebody else's. Or, maybe they had your charity in another one and they just dropped you and just let that other charity in. Those people are still in this category. They were charitable before, they're still charitable. So that means for an individual charity, the retention rates must be lower than this, because this is showing the retention rates of having any charity in an estate plan. So the retention rates for a specific charity have to be lower than this, because what we're observing here is people that went to having no charities at all. Charity switching is shown as they're still have a charitable estate component, even though a particular charity may have been dropped. So good news, bad news on that. Let's take a look at what happens with these retention rates more directly. So here, what we're looking at is charitable plan loss trajectory. Now, this is slightly different, only just slightly different than what we saw before in this way. We actually are going to start with the 98 survey. That was the very first survey that was representative of the entire 50-plus population. And we're only going to look at people who said they had a charitable component in both the 1998 study and the 2000 study. Now, the reason we do that is that these are people that this is not an accident, right? That, oh yeah, I answered that question wrong. Okay, this is both in 98 and in 2000. They're saying, yes, I've got a charitable component. Yes, I've got a charitable component. So we're actually looking at those, really solid. Definitely, they do have a charitable component. And again, the same idea that each year we're going to say, among those who are still answering the question in the next survey wave, what percentage still say, yes, I've got a charitable component. And again, the survey is given in even years, so that's why we keep getting these results. So what happens? Well, we are down to almost just a little over 80% retention 2 years later. A little better than 75% retention 4 years later. We get to 6 years later, we're dropping down to about 72% retention. 8 years later, 70%, probably about 68% retention here. 10 years later, dropping down to about 64-ish%. 12 years later, 4 years later, we're about 62, 63%. And here, when we're looking 16 years later, we are, 61, 62%. So we do see bigger drop-offs in the beginning a bit, and then the drop-off slows a little bit. So even of this highly confident group, we are seeing this year after year negative trajectory. Now, just as a reminder, just to be clear, these are real retention rates. This has nothing to do with people dying or dropping out of the survey during this period of time. Okay, we're only looking at the percentage of people who still say they have a charitable component among those who are still answering the question in each survey wave. Okay, so it doesn't affect these percentages directly when people die or drop out, because we're only looking at the percentage who still say they have a charitable component among those who are still answering the question. And even with this group that were really confident have that charitable component, and they had it for at least 2 years, we're still seeing this dropping, this instability in the charitable component. So as we put all of this together, what becomes very clear is that the charitable component in estate plans tracked over time is not stable. There are particular times when it becomes particularly unstable, such as near the end of life and when family structure changes. But in general, that charitable plan, even if it's one that has been in place for a while, it is not stable. Now, this is not convenient news for fundraisers who want to be able to count that somebody has put their organization in the plan and simply forget about that person and just assume that the money will ultimately come forward. It does not make life easier for fundraisers, but I would suggest that it can be helpful. Now, I understand there's the opposite interpretation of these results, that it might be better just to ignore them, and that would allow us to more comfortably be able to simply count it and forget it when it comes to fundraising. That just think that once we're in the will, that's all we have to do, and simply set it and forget it, and in 10 or 20 or 30 years, that money will come through. I hope that your reaction, if you're in the fundraising space, to this information is not along the lines of this, which is my favorite student evaluation from a personal finance class, and this was shared with me from Dr. Bill Gustafson, that the student didn't like the class. It was all about reality, and the student didn't want to know this stuff. Well, I think it is stuff that we need to know if Ultimately, your goal is not simply to move a metric and to hit some artificial goal, but if it is to actually get resources to the charity, to actually get money to the charity through estate gifts, then it's important to know how these decisions occur and how they change over time. Now, this contrasts with a different concept, and that is the concept of once in, always in. And I have to admit, this is a really attractive concept, because if this were true, then as a fundraiser, I could work with people my own age. I could count those gifts and rest assured that that money was ultimately, eventually coming in. And so this is a really attractive concept because it makes my life easier as a fundraiser to know that, look, once you're in the plan, you're always in the plan. You don't need to worry about it. You can simply count it and forget it. So where does that misconception come from? Aside from the fact that this is a reality that people within the industry wish was true. And to be honest with you, I wish it was true as well. Well, part of that problem comes from the sources of information we've had in the past. Essentially, the information we've had in the past has been from relatively small one-time surveys. Now, as we've already seen from the evidence, these plans destabilize as death nears. That's where we see all of this instability, or at least a lot of it. Okay. Now, that instability, you're not going to pick that up in a one-time survey. Okay, certainly not a one-time survey of people who are younger, people who are not in this stage of life. You actually cannot see that unless you've got the whole lifetime picture, so that you can see how plans change year after year after year. That's the only way you're going to pick up this relatively high level of instability at the end of life. So part of the reason that we've not previously been able to dismiss the concept of once in, always in is because we simply didn't have that information to take this and say, well, no, actually we can observe that is not true. The other is a bit of a misinterpretation that took place in large part because there is an audience for saying that once in, always in is true. And there was a time where within the industry, there was this misquotation of a good study, but a study that didn't show this, that actually would have been impossible for it to show this, that the National Council on Planned Giving 2000 study showed that 90% of planned bequest donors don't change their plans. Okay, that is completely impossible for that study to have shown, because this study was a study only of people who still had the charitable component in their estate plan. Okay, so all of that instability that we just got through looking at here, all of this instability of the people who have dropped the charitable component, by the definition of that study, all of these people were excluded. That was a study only of people who still had the charitable component in their estate plan. Okay, so understand that that was a one-time survey of people who were in these categories, that is, people who still had the charitable component. So to suggest that that study was measuring the size of everybody else up here, the size of the people who did not keep a charitable component, completely misunderstands the study. It could not have said anything about these people because it excluded all of these people. It only included people that actually still had their charitable component. And what exactly did it say? Well, what it said is that if charity stayed in, that the people reported that the plan changes decreased the total amount of what was in for charity only about 10% of the time, right? So it showed that if charity stayed in, plan changes decreased total charitable amount only 10% of the time. Two things to keep in mind in addition about that. The people who were surveyed had an average age of 58. Okay? Among those with an average age of 58, with a charitable plan, 10% chose amount decreased when asked about their overall plan. Has the amount of the charitable bequest ever increased or decreased? Okay. So does this finding that if we take a group of people with an average age of 58, a lot younger, a lot older, that only 10% among those who still have a charitable component are going to indicate that the charitable bequest amount had decreased over time, although it stayed in the plan? Well, that's a useful and interesting finding. It in no way contradicts what these previous findings from the Health and Retirement Study have indicated. So again, just to take a look at it, let's look at this study. Of course, we're looking at an older population here. This is looking at people who dropped charity out of their will at all, whereas the study from NCPG in 2000 was looking at among those who still had a charitable component. So, for example, if we're looking at age 50, it would be among this group. Did that charitable component, did it go up some? Did it stay the same? Or did it go down? Okay, that's the question that was being addressed by that study. It was not looking at these people who had dropped in the meantime. Those people were excluded from the study. So there's no contradiction there. It is also the case that when we look at, for example, what's happening in the last couple of to the last estate plan. Now again, realize that this study showing all of this end-of-life instability, this was a study of decedents' estates who had actually transferred dollars to charity at death. This in no way contradicts what a survey of people whose average age is 58 would say about the increase or decrease in the charitable component. Okay, so there's no contradiction here of those findings. They're just asking completely different questions. Now, obviously, this is important, and it turns out that is far more important than whether or not the amount of the charitable plan dropped at around an average age of 58. So, this misinterpretation is false. 90% of plan bequest donors don't change their plans. Completely false. This study was very useful, very helpful, but it answered a completely different question. So, what do we do now? If we recognize that once in, always in is completely false, if we recognize that there is an enormous end-of-life instability in the charitable component in an estate plan, how do we deal with this? Well, let me suggest to you that what I typically see is that it's not that charities don't manage this exactly in the right way. It is that charities manage this exactly, precisely in the wrong way. Let me explain what I mean. What you're looking at here is you are looking at the giving and volunteering behavior of decedents who actually transferred dollars to charity at death. You're looking at their lifetime giving and volunteering behavior. Now, if we go back, say, 8 years before these people passed away, we're getting almost 70% of them are donors, giving $500 or more, and a substantial share of them, about 43%, are also volunteers. Now notice when we get to these last 2 years prior to death, at this stage, only about half are still donors. So you see how this tendency to donate goes down as people approach death, and as well as, certainly even more dramatically, the tendency to volunteer goes down. Now, what happens is that among this group, and notice these are all people who actually made transfers to charity through their estate plans at death. Real dollars went to charity. That about half of them were not donors during their last couple of years of life. Okay. What happens is you have charities that communicate to their friends and supporters based solely on recency of donation. Somebody who hasn't donated for 2 years, in a lot of organizations, they just fall off the map. Now, if that happens, person's not donating, they've not been donating for a couple of years, they fall off the map. When is the charity going to stop communicating? Well, actually, the charity's going to stop communicating exactly at, in fact, exactly at this period of time, right? Right when the majority of charitable estate decisions and charitable dollars, right when the majority of those decisions are being made. The last 2 to 5 years of life, a lot of them in the last 2 years prior to death, and the majority in the last 2 to 5 years of life, that's when these decisions are being made, and it is also the exact time when charities who communicate, as many charities do, based upon recency of giving, they'll stop communicating altogether. Now, this does not mean that the charities need to keep asking for, another $50. It does mean that they need to stay connected, stay in front of those long-term supporters. So don't go radio silent at the most critical time. The other thing it suggests is that this strategy of count it and forget it does not work. Now look, I understand there are a lot of charities that want to have a $1 billion campaign or whatever their goal is. And when they're not able to hit that goal, it's a lot easier to count revocable gifts, funny money, and you say, congratulations, we've hit that goal. And that's what a number of organizations, largely universities, did. And in many cases, they were simply counting gifts that had been there for years. They knew that had been in the plan. They just counted them all at the same time. So, and in fact, I have an entire presentation where we'll look at this topic of how do we count revocable gifts. But clearly, if we actually want to bring dollars into the organization, this strategy of count it because we're in the plan and forget it, meaning we don't stay in connection with those people, doesn't work because there is so much instability in the charitable component. We need to understand that a bequest commitment is a beginning of a process that leads to money coming to the charity, not the end of that process. And the challenge that happens here is you often have people in legacy fundraising who are being managed by those who who understand only major gifts. A major gift is the end of a long process to bring money to the organization. A bequest commitment is a beginning of a long process to bring money into the organization. And there are many organizations that reward people for essentially going out and beginning as many possible relationships as you can, but gives them no reward for maintaining or continuing those relationships. So, what are some other things that that this tells us about managing these gifts? Well, one of the things it says is that there's actually a higher value in converting donors to irrevocable commitments. If you were representing the interests of a nonprofit and you thought that once you were in the charitable estate plan, you were always going to be in the charitable estate plan, and you could count it and forget it, then there wouldn't be that much value in trying to convert people from a revocable bequest gift, such as in a living trust or in a gift in a will, to an irrevocable commitment. But now that we see all of this end-of-life instability, the reality is that there is a lot of value in being able to convert people into these other plan-giving vehicles, all of which do have a charitable estate component. That is, money goes to charity at the end of life, but they are irrevocable commitments. Well, since we know that there's a lot of instability in these revocable bequest commitments, taking those as a first step to then move people over to the irrevocable commitments makes a lot more sense. Since we know there's that instability in the revocable commitments, there's value in looking at the bequest commitment as a beginning, as a first step, that we either need to steward all the way until the end, or we need to manage to convert from a revocable commitment into some form of an irrevocable commitment. Now again, with all of this bad news that I give people, I want to be very clear that I am not saying that it is not a good idea to get in the plan early. We have seen very clear evidence that getting in the plan early makes sense. When we look at the last-minute plans, they don't produce as much money as the long-term plans or as the plans that were the charitable components that were in a plan before and then came back at the last minute. So again, just as a reminder, one longer-term plan was worth 4 first made in the last 2 years, or a truly last-minute plan. So it's important to keep in mind that getting in the plan early is fantastic. It is something that we want to do. This does not mean that we don't want to get in the plan early. Those do produce larger gifts, but it does mean they've got to stay in the plan, and we can't just count it and forget it. If they stay in or if they come back later, those do produce larger gifts. Now, fundamentally, what does this mean? If you haven't made this connection yet, let me make it very directly for you now. Do not ignore your oldest supporters. We see all of this end-of-life instability in the charitable component. Do not ignore your oldest supporters. There is this concept that at a certain age, people just become cognitively fossilized and they don't change their mind about the charitable component in an estate plan. And that, we can now say, fundamentally is not true. So that means you can't just count it and forget it. You can't just ignore them. And let me be more specific on defining and maybe redefining for you what I mean by your oldest supporters. These are results from the Australian study of probate records, a 5% sample of national probate records in Australia. And what this is showing is the age at the signing of the last will, at the signing of the only will that controls anything, which is only the final will. It's showing the age at the will signing for charitable bequest wills and here's the critical thing, by the share of total bequest dollars transferred. So this is not the percentage of people signing charitable wills. This is the percentage of total charitable bequest dollars transferred by the age at which those wills were signed. Okay. Now, the bottom line result here is that 76% of the dollars transferred to charity through wills in Australia were transferred by wills signed in the 80s, 90s, or older. 76% of the dollars. Okay. Now, if we're interested in wills signed before age 70, that's great. That's 13% of the charitable dollars were controlled by wills signed before age 70. Now, of course, from this, we might have, we have the information of the age at which the final will was signed. But because these are probate records, we don't have the information on what the previous wills might have been, or if there were any previous wills, because the probate records only show the final will that's actually used to transfer the dollars to charity at death. So we can't exactly tell from this by itself how much plan instability there is. We only know that the plan changed in some way, because why would you sign a new will if you didn't have a change in the plan? The plan only changed in some way at this age. But we couldn't say for sure whether or not the charitable component of the plan had changed. Even though they signed the will at this oldest age, you could make the argument that, well, yeah, sure, they signed the will when they're in their 80s and 90s, but that charitable component didn't change. That wasn't the reason they signed the new will. But of course, if we flip back to the U.S. data, where we can actually see what was the plan in the last year, last 2 years, last 5 years prior to death, we see there's enormous instability at the end of life. So that those new will documents being signed in the 80s and 90s that control the bulk of the dollars, those documents actually do have changes in them, which of course they would have to, otherwise why would you sign a document or a new document? But in particular, they have changes in the charitable component of those documents. At least that's what we see from the U.S. data. So understand that the critical decision-making time period that we're talking about, if, and again, this is only if you care about total charitable bequest dollars transferred, the critical decision-making time period takes place at a much older age. That's where we get all of these actual documents that actually control the charitable bequest dollars being signed. Now, we can't actually replicate this study with the U.S. data in the health and retirement study. And the reason we can't replicate this is we don't know when the final will was signed. Because if that new will did not completely add charity in where there had been no charity before, or completely drop charity when there had been charity before, then we can't see when that final will was signed. So we can't actually replicate this study exactly because there's lots of wills that would be signed at these older ages that we couldn't see any difference, because we can't see any difference unless they completely drop the charitable component, or if they didn't have a charitable component before and then they add one in. So I hope that makes sense, that like if you're in your 90s and you sign a new will that switches your charitable component from one charity to another, that's going to show up in this study. but it's not going to show up in the health and retirement study because all we will see is that in 1 year you said, yes, I have a charitable component, and then in the next 2 years later you said, yes, I still have a charitable component, and then when you died, you transferred dollars to charity, right? We can't see that charity switching that would actually involve these new wills being signed. So even though we can't exactly replicate that study, we can take a look at something similar. So what we're looking at here is a slightly different question. We're looking at the age when people were reporting the first charitable plan that was not later removed. Okay? So that's as close as we can get to saying this was the final charitable plan. Now again, the age at which this final charitable plan was added may have been older, because if they engage in charity switching, we don't know that. We can't see charity switching. We can only see if they completely dropped all charity. So this is the age when reporting the first charitable plan that was not later dropped out. Okay, so it's not the last charitable plan. Now, so you have to understand, like, this is the last charitable plan, which is the only one that controls any dollars. This is the age at the first charitable plan that was not later removed. Okay, so these are kind of bookends, right? This is when the last charitable plan was signed. This is when the first charitable plan that was not later removed was signed. Again, we can't see if there was in fact instability in switching charities. We can't see that, but at least this was the first time a charitable plan was reported that was not later entirely removed. Okay. Also, these are results only for 80% of the charitable estate decedents in the HRS. And the reason it's only 80% is we have a 20% minority that came into the study reporting a charitable plan, and every single year they had a charitable plan. So we can't analyze it for that group. We can only analyze it for the group that did not come in to the study saying that they had a charitable plan. So to connect this back with something we've seen before, just as a reminder, 20% of estates in black here, this 20% of estates, these are the folks that came into the health and retirement study saying they had a charitable component, and they never dropped that charitable component. They might have changed it, but they never dropped that charitable component. That 20%, we can't say when they first added the charitable component that was never dropped, okay? Because they came in with it and they never dropped it. So they did that at some age that was younger than the age at which they entered the study, okay? So we can't observe those. But for the 80% of folks that are not in that category, we can see when their first charitable plan that wasn't dropped was added. Okay, so we've already looked at the last. Now we're looking at the first stable charitable plan, and what do we see? We see that the majority of those initial charitable plans that were not later removed came about during the 80s. Okay, so the majority, this is the 80s here, 53% of the first occurrence of a charitable plan that was not later removed, that happened in the 80s. Not so much in the 90s. It appears that critical decision-making time for at least initially introducing the charitable plan into the estate plan that was not later removed, it takes place in the 80s. 27% takes place in the 70s. So 70s and 80s, but predominantly the 80s is the key age group. Again, these ages are younger than what we saw in the study from Australia. Australia says 76% in the 80s or older, and this is saying 55% in the 80s or older. This does not contradict this. This is the age at the last will, the one that controlled the charitable document. This is the age at the first charitable will that was not, if their charitable component was not later removed. So that's why this is a younger age. But this younger age, the age at the signing of the first will with the charitable component that was not later removed, this younger age, we're still talking the 80s. Okay, a little bit in the 70s, not much in the 90s, but we're still talking the 80s. So the critical decision-making time that we're looking at here is actually in the 80s. So let's look at it a different way. If you wanted to know let's say you had a group of people, group of donors, and you wanted to know at what age should I expect to have received half of the dollars from that group of people, and the answer from the Australian study was age 90. Okay. Now, this number, age 85, this is too young. The reason it's too young is that this study was done in 2010 and 2012. This study started out in 1992. Longevity has increased almost every single year all the way through for this period. And so this number is lower than it should be. If we actually age adjusted for the years that this was happening and projected it to present day, this number would be closer to this. But with the Australian study, this age 90, that is the age at which you would have received half of your dollars. Okay? Think about that for a minute. That means you're going to get half of your dollars from donors who die at age 90 or older. Okay? So there is, in some sense, this concept of what do we mean by older? Now, this doesn't mean that half of the people are going to die after age 90. No, of course not. But wealthy people live longer than average people. And so half of your dollars are going to be coming in at 90 or older. So half of your dollars are going to be coming in at age 90 or older because wealthy people live longer. It doesn't mean that half of your donors are going to live to age 90, but it means half of your dollars are going to live to age 90. If you keep in mind, of course, that most realized charitable bequests are added within 5 years of death, you combine these factors, it lets us know that the critical decision-making time that we really care about, honestly, it's in the 80s. The 80s is the key. The 80s is the age when these decisions are ultimately made, when they are changed. We know that from when the final will is signed, that transfers the charitable dollars. We know that from when the first charitable will that was not later dropped was signed, at least among the 80% of folks who didn't come in already having a charitable will come into that study. So the critical decision-making time for the first charitable will that was not later removed was the 80s. The critical decision-making time for the last charitable will that actually transferred the dollars was the 80s. And when do we expect to get half of our dollars? Probably half of them are going to come after the 80s. Half of them are going to come 90 or older. We've got to reconceptualize what we think about in terms of when these decisions are made and who our target audience is. So let's look a bit at how this plays out in reality. Now, we do not have organizational level data in the U.S. In other words, there is no central source that we can go to that would say who's doing well on getting charitable estate gifts and who's not. There is a form, IRS 990, that organizations fill out. They do have to report how much they're getting in fundraising. They do have to report whether they're getting cash or stocks or real estate or all of those items, but they do not report how much they got from an estate transfer versus current dollars. So we really don't know, except if incidentally organizations choose to share some of that data. However, in the UK, that is not the case. In the UK, we actually have organizational data with every will being read that we know exactly how much those organizations are getting from bequest gifts, and we know how much they're getting from other fundraising. So what I'm showing you here is the results from 1 year of that, where we're looking at UK fundraising charities that were in the top 100 fundraising charities overall. Okay, so these are the biggest 100 fundraising charities in the UK, biggest by the amount of money they're raising from fundraising. Now, from that top 100, I'm only going to pull those who receive at least 40% of their total fundraising income from bequest gifts. Okay, so these are big fundraising organizations. They're in the 100 largest fundraising organizations in the UK that are receiving at least 40% of their total fundraising income from bequests. All right. Now, the reason that I'm showing you this is I want you to think about, with this list, and there are some exceptions, but think about, do these charities, the big charities that are receiving the big chunks of charitable bequest dollars, do these charities represent causes that are naturally in front of people in their 80s? What is naturally in front of people in their 80s? Pets. You know, the kids are long gone. The kids are in their 60s, right? Pets and healthcare. In particular, any healthcare that is age-related healthcare. Those are things, those are causes that, without even trying, they are causes that are in front of people in their 80s. Now, organizations can be intentionally in front of this group, regardless of their cause, but they have to do it on purpose. Organizations that represent these kinds of causes, they are just in front of people in their 80s because of who they are, not because necessarily they're brilliant at connecting with this particular audience. So let's look at these top fundraising organizations, or I should say, let's look at these top fundraising charities that get the largest share of their income from bequests. What's number one? Dogs and Cats Home. Okay, so what do we got? We got pets. Number two, now this is kind of a British thing, so I understand the American audience doesn't understand donkeys as pet kind of animals, but that is actually a very large charity in the UK. And then what are some other things that we see there? Well, again, if you see, now we're down to number three, arthritis research. Sorry, misspelling there, should be campaign. Arthritis research campaign. Is that an age-related healthcare concern? Absolutely. Is that a concern that's naturally in front of people in their 80s? Absolutely. What's the next one down? And of course, they get 3/4. They're in the top 100 fundraising charities, and they get 3/4 of their money from bequests. 72% of all the dollars from Erskine, which is Veterans Health Care. We've got sort of the double benefit here of healthcare concerns in front of people in their 80s and veterans. Veterans organizations very much in front of people in their 80s. 68% of income for Royal National Institute for deaf people. Hearing-related healthcare concerns. Are hearing-related healthcare concerns naturally in front of people in their 80s? Absolutely. Again, here, about 2/3 of income from Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, going back to pets. 62% of the income for cats protection. 62% of the income for guide dogs for the blind. Blind veterans here, 60% of their income. Parkinson's disease. Royal National Institute for Blind People, another pets organization. A veterinary charity. So again, looking a lot at pets. Help the Aged. Okay. Now here with Barnardo's, we get our first charity. Well, maybe this one is perhaps not age-related. And here's another one that's not age-related. It's a children's poverty charity. Okay. So you don't have to be in one of these causes to do really well in bequest dollars, but it certainly helps if you are, for example, representing a hospice, or if you're representing an age-related healthcare concern, such as cancer or stroke. These things are very helpful. So again, when we look at the organizations that and the causes that they represent that are getting large chunks of their income from bequests that are themselves overall very large fundraising charities, we do see a predominance of these age-related healthcare concerns, pets, things that are naturally in front of people at that age group. Now, there are exceptions to that. Barnardo's here is an exception. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution is an exception. There are definite exceptions to that. Perhaps Royal Society for Protection of Birds maybe it is an exception. But I think what it tells us is very simply this. If you have friends who are 75 and above with lifetime connections, you've got to stay top of the mind. Okay? This is when the decisions are being made. Now, top of the mind does not have to mean that you're simply asking for another $50. It might be some other way of connection, or some other way of simply communication, or maybe honoring or thanking people, or maybe you're just sharing stories of others who have included these kinds of gifts, right? So there's lots of ways that we can stay connected to this audience. Now, two issues that sometimes come up with this. People will say, okay, that's great. You've made my life much harder to say that I've got to focus on people in these age groups if I'm interested in ultimately the dollars coming into the organization. But what about the concerns about cognitive decline, right? Well, let me say two things about that issue. Number one, yes, we do see in population averages at older ages the combined or average cognitive scores go down. That, however, does not mean that the 90-year-old sitting across from the table from you having a conversation is not a lot smarter than you are. You have to understand that a shift in the population average doesn't tell us a whole lot about an individual. So don't assume that there are cognitive issues just because of a person's age, okay? Not just because it's ageist, but because it's not accurate. You know something about a population does not mean you know something about an individual. The second is, If at any point you ever become in the least bit uncomfortable with asking for money because of cognitive concerns, then stop asking for money. Staying connected does not need to involve asking for money. It could be something as simple as, you've had a lifetime of history with this organization. We just want to let you know what's happening recently. Or we just want to say thank you for that long history, and to say it's okay that you're not donating right now. We understand. We still consider you family because of this whole lifetime of connection that you've had with the organization. So stop asking for money if you have any concerns about asking for money. But that doesn't mean stop communicating. It doesn't mean stop mailing, stop letting them know what's going on, stop making them feel like they're connected to the organization. Okay, so that would be my comments. And one of the things, and I understand that I'm jumping onto a different topic here, where we're looking at the importance of message rather than just the statistics and demographics. But I want to share with you one result that we'll spend even more time talking about later. But this was from a study with 3,000 people going through their normal estate planning process. Okay, 3,000 people going through their normal estate planning process. This was done in the UK. 1,000 of them got the standard estate planning questions. Basically, where do you want things to go? What do you own? And another 1,000 of them were randomly assigned to receive one extra question. Would you like to leave any money to charity in your will? Okay. And then the final third were randomly assigned to receive this question. Many of our customers like to leave money to charity in their will. This question instead of this question. That single question, would you like to leave any money to charity in your will, increased by more than double the share of people actually including charity in their actual will documents. If you used a social norm statement, many of our customers like to leave money to charity in their will. You more than triple the share of people who are actually including gifts to charity in their will. This decision is a highly unstable decision. If you have any substantial economic decision that you can triple the participation rate with a single sentence, many of our customers like to leave money to charity in their will, you have an unstable financial decision. Now, the reason that instability, as we see here, a single sentence, oh, I wasn't thinking about it, or a sentence that with a social norm, the reason why that instability is so important is because it tells us how important it is to stay on top of the mind for this group of donors or former donors, or even people who are non-donors that have expressed any sort of interest in the cause. Staying on top of the mind, how important is it? More than doubles just asking the question. Just asking the question, do you want to do this or not? And obviously saying that other people like to do it more than triples that participation rate. Is staying on top of the mind important? Oh my goodness. It doubles, it triples what people are actually doing. So instability here, dramatic instability here, doubling and tripling from a single sentence, a major financial decision, fits with what we see with the instability in the actual changes in the charitable component of the estate plan. So fundamentally, what we need to keep in mind is this reality. If you are interested in actually getting money to the charitable causes, the score doesn't count until the clock runs out. Count it and forget it, that does not work. Once in the plan, always in the plan, that is simply false. The score doesn't count until the clock runs out. These decisions are largely decisions made in the 80s, at least the decisions that control the dollars. Now, this makes this more difficult because we've got to stay connected with people over the long term. But it also means that we've got a more complicated reality. Again, there was a time in history, if we were to go back 50 years, where estate planning was a process that took place at one point in time in the lawyer's office when a person signed a will document. But in the U.S., that is no longer the reality. Because in the U.S., in only 38% of the cases do the will documents that a person has reported immediately prior to death, do those documents control anything? Because of why? Well, because the assets are controlled by transfer on death, pay on death designations, beneficiary designations. They're in joint accounts with right of survivorship. And so what happens is you have somebody who has a charitable component in their will. It says, here it is. You can look at it. It says, I'm giving 10% to my alma mater. In fact, I've even been credited with that in their campaign that they held, and I send them a copy of it, which they have a copy of this page of the will document that controls no assets that I will change within the last 2 to 5 years prior to death. So again, this is a world where you can have a copy of the will document, and when that donor walks into their bank to open an account, and they're asked, do you want to put a TOD on that? Yes, let's put the kids on there. They're cutting out that charitable plan. When that donor opens up an IRA or a 401k or transfers that IRA or 401k to a new financial institution, and the institution says, did you want, who's the beneficiary on this account? Oh, well, the kids are the beneficiary. They have now removed that asset from the charitable gift. So keep in mind that this is not just the instability in the charitable will. We've got actually a much higher level of instability in the overall estate plan because of this reality that plans change every time a donor opens a new account or changes a joint account owner. Okay, so this level of instability that I was showing you in the will and trust documents, the reality is the actual estate planning instability is much, much higher. Plans change every time a donor opens a new account that has a TOD, POD, beneficiary designation, or joint account ownership. So we've got to stay on top of things. We've got to stay connected with people, understanding that. In addition to this reality, we see the other reality that plans become unstable as death approaches. And if we care about the dollars, the only will we care about is the final will. That's the only one that controls any dollars, so it's the only one we should care about. Bottom line, what this means is stay connected, stay communicating. Hey, it's great to get in the plan early. You generate larger gifts when you get in the plan early. But you've got to stay in the plan because the score doesn't count until the clock runs out.